Thanks, Nisa. I'm delighted to be joined today by Krug from Pantera Capital. Hey, Joey, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure. So given the crescendo of hype around building something around something called DeFi, you must be a little like, oh, been there, done that. So for our viewers who might not be aware, can you give us a little bit of your early history into the foray of decentralized finance that started back in 2014 with Augur?
Sure. Yeah, so I got into the Ethereum space, I'd say, in 2014. Initially I was building this thing called Augur. And the idea was to build a peer-to-peer prediction market, or basically a betting market, where there was no counterparty who processed your bets. There was no one person who controlled all the funds, that sort of thing. And we were trying to build it on Bitcoin. And it was just we would have had to modify a ton of things about Bitcoin and basically fork it to do anything. And so, we came across Ethereum and started building it there. And that was kind of like how I sort of first got into DeFi. There wasn't a lot on Ethereum at the time. It was sort of just us and MakerDAO.
Yeah. Well, and for those who've been experimenting with and trying to build on Bitcoin's original foundation in the early days, it seems like some of those earlier solutions, perhaps started a bit too early and just lacked the benefit of the, innovations that came later in the infrastructure. So, Augur has stayed the course and indeed had a recent upgrade. So, along this journey, what were the most important lessons that you and Augur and the team have learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of it surrounds, things about building on kind of nascent infrastructure. So when we started building on Ethereum, we wrote Augur in this programming language called Serpent. And that language actually ended up being deprecated. So no one uses Serpent, almost nobody's heard of it anymore. And now everyone uses this language called Solidity, but when we started, Solidity didn't exist. And so at one point we had to rewrite our entire code base from Serpent to Solidity. And so, if you look at how early stuff is, I think that there's a lot of things that we've learned there about how to build effectively on new infrastructure. Maybe you would build something smaller first because there's a good chance you will have to just rewrite the whole thing. Stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's, a fair amount of people that, argue around, is it the market or is it the technology that drives some of this innovation forward? And that, the traditional financial market infrastructure can't be solved with technology alone, and that, technology itself isn't the issue. But in the example you just gave, it was a pretty significant issue. So, how many people in the industry do you think have taken this technology first approach? And do you think that, thinking about DeFi on a wider scale, are there just too many solutions looking for a problem, or are all of these ideas that are being explored, have intrinsic value?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at why a lot of these solutions don't necessarily solve a problem per se for the end user, I think a lot of it comes back to the fact that it's really hard to paper over the user experience of building on something like Ethereum. Yeah. And so if you look at who they provide value for today, it's mostly people who already own Ether. If you look at the transaction costs to do something on Ethereum, as of this morning, it's around 200 gwei, which means to send money from one person to another, it's like $10. An Augur trade would be like $90 or $100. And so the main use cases right now are just people speculating on other stuff within crypto. And I think to get out of that and to build stuff that people want to use outside of that, the costs need to come down a lot, and it needs to be much faster to use. People aren't going to be comfortable waiting 5 to 10 minutes for a transaction to go through. They'll want to sort of see it instantly. And so I think, or within a few seconds. And so those are, I think, the big problems. even once you solve those, there's still going to be a lot of stuff built that isn't really solving a problem that anybody has, but that's fine. That's sort of how all tech startups work. If people were perfect about predicting which ones would solve a problem and which wouldn't, VC portfolios wouldn't have like a 80 to 90% failure rate.
Yeah. So sticking with that technology topic, oracles are services that are designed to feed external information into blockchains for interpretation have become a hot topic recently, with projects like Chainlink and Band receiving a lot of attention. And so, these are also the latest iterations of earlier examples. And this is an era that Augur looked to address from its very beginning. So what are your thoughts on the current hype around these projects? Or, maybe not specifically these projects, but projects like these. And is collating and reliably distributing information in this way actually viable?
Yeah, so I think for the Oracle problem, it's really a tough problem, and the main criteria that surrounds the problem is how fast do you need the data. If you don't need the data, at a very, very high frequency, things like Augur really are the sort of best solution for that. If you need some piece of data on the scale of days, for instance. But if you need some data that's updated every 5 minutes, today you pretty much have to use something like Chainlink, or you can kind of like do it yourself, I guess, which is sort of what Compound's done. You can get a group of people to provide the results and take like the median of them or whatever, which is essentially what MakerDAO does. But they sort of all converge to a very similar system. I think the problem with all those approaches is that unless you do something beyond that, it's not very secure. Like from an economic standpoint, it's not very secure. The incentives aren't really that aligned. There are like theoretical improvements you could do to fix that though. Like there's a couple papers published by one of the like technical advisors to Chainlink or whatever that talk about provably getting data from a website, that improving that you didn't modify the data sort of en route before you submit that on chain. And like if somebody or Chainlink themselves were to launch that functionality, you would get pretty close to solving the problem. But there's one last problem with the Oracle problem, which is that websites themselves are not necessarily reliable. So for instance, the site may be down, it may be providing a faulty result. This is something that you may think is not that prevalent, but like when you look at like Augur markets, for instance, there have been some where like somebody said, what's the price of 0x according to Yahoo Finance, which you would think is like decently reliable. But it's like down a lot of the time, or even worse than down, providing actually incorrect data. Yeah. And so I think it's a tough problem.
Well, so, and then there's always that question around, the tech being replacing the human, right? And is there, a possibility that this could be gamed without some kind of human moderation?
Right. I think I think it is. I think there's like one way to prevent it from being gamed, which is like you have sources that are like sort of whitelisted, where like you can only use certain sources. I think if you allow anyone to submit a source, it can be gamed, because the problem is you either have to like take sort of a median of the results and penalize people who were wrong. But the problem is that the source itself is telling you lies. Like say I have a source that it's like a random Russian roulette where I ping it, it gives me the result 42. You ping it, gives you the result 47. And the person down the street pings it. Yeah. And it's just like, so we would get penalized even though we did nothing wrong. So the solution people have today as well, we'll just not penalize people. But that's not secure from a different standpoint. And so it's like, it's this really weird catch-22 where there is no like great solution, and I don't think anybody has like a perfect solution to this problem.
Okay. Well, so these days you're now the co-CIO at one of the most established blockchain-focused VCs in the space, Pantera Capital. Tell us a little bit about that. How did you end up in that role?
Yeah, so I ended up at Pantera. Let's see. So I've been doing a good amount of like angel investing, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, kind of in late 2015, early 2016. And with one of my friends, he built this angel syndicate where we would basically just do deals in companies that we were friends with or that we thought were interesting. I had also started advising a few companies, particularly in the crypto space. And I ended up meeting Pantera through, I basically, so 0x, the decentralized exchange project. I wrote one of the very first checks into that company, and I introduced them to other VCs in the space. And one of them was Pantera. And after that, they sort of reached out and mentioned that they were looking to sort of launch these couple new funds and we're looking to bring on a technical partner. And I thought that was interesting. And I sort of knew that a lot of infrastructure and things needed to be funded for this space to actually work. So I was excited about that. And I also enjoy investing. I like working with companies. It's something I think is pretty fun.
Yeah. So you previously kind of been on the other side of the fence. What insight do you think, having previously been, a crypto pioneer and an investee, has given you in turning into being an investor?
Yeah, I think it mainly surrounds like things that you would come across building a company that are sort of classic mistakes people make, but having sort of been there to help founders and entrepreneurs kind of avoid those mistakes is one of them. I'd say a lot of the advice that I provide to founders surrounds things like hiring, how to run a proper hiring process, how do you hire engineers effectively. I've noticed that a lot of founders feel overwhelmed about hiring, and I sort of did as well when I first started doing anything. But then, at this point, like hiring is not something I get overwhelmed about. It's sort of like, yeah, you can do that. Like there's a process you can run around it. It's not really that hard. But that's like one big thing founders think is really difficult. And then also just like more general kind of strategy stuff, whether it's like a token project who wants help on thinking through certain economic incentives of the thing that they're designing, or really sort of anything. But I think my advice sort of centers around the fact that I've sort of been an operator building stuff in this space in the past.
Yeah.
Also just surrounding like quirks in crypto, like, hey, like that thing that you want to build on that looks great on paper, like actually, I've tried to build on that in the past and it's not as far along as you think. Maybe you should try looking at this thing instead. There's like a lot of that in the scalability space, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. So what projects and verticals are you paying the most attention to now? People ask me about, trends, what's next, what's important. And I always say it's really difficult to separate the hype from a legitimate trend, right? So
right.
What are you excited about at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I think I'm excited about the growth in decentralized exchange volumes. I think that's something that, there's hype right now, but it's going to become a longer term sustainable trend. I think that continues to grow. I think, peer-to-peer lending protocols, I think are interesting as well. Stuff like Compound, obviously a lot of the high numbers right now are due to the fact that you can earn comp, but I think, a lot of it is actually just legitimate demand as well. So stuff like that, I think is very interesting. And then I guess the last thing I'm excited about is I'm excited to see some of these like sort of options and derivatives protocols and stuff go live. Basically, I think all these sort of interesting DeFi applications are things that I've been interested sort of the whole time. Yeah. And a lot of them are finally starting to go live.
Well, so knowing what you know now, from founding a company, building a platform, launching products, now being an investor and an advisor, if you were going to go back and do it all over again and start a new project, what would it be?
I think if I were to do it over again, I'd probably do stuff that's simpler, that like new, that I knew would be very easy to make work. And then eventually once the space had kind of had more solid infrastructure and was much easier to build on than I build, the complicated, interesting thing that I really kind of wanted to build. But I think in the crypto space, there's been a lot of low hanging fruit over the years where it's been like, very, very, very easy to build that low hanging fruit, and much more rapid to experiment. And it's stuff that like makes sense to build on Ethereum today. So I think if you look at kind of like in the past, I've built stuff where it needs Ethereum to scale to really work. And back in 2014, everybody, including Vitalik, thought Ethereum would be scalable in 2 years, and including myself, we thought that. Like we thought, oh, it's not that hard of a problem. We'll launch proof of stake and then we'll be doing 1,000 TPS. Maybe not 1,000, but a few hundred. It was like that was like in the bag almost. People thought that was going to happen. And it's finally starting to happen, but we're now 5 6 years later.
Yeah, it wasn't 2 years, right? Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's been fascinating having this chat with you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us. If people want to get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing at Pantera, or indeed anything else about what we've talked about, how can they do that?
Yeah, so the simplest ways I would say are Twitter and email. So my Twitter is just at Joey Krug. And then my email is joeykrug@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Joey. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.